Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 8th of August of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with Kherson area. To be more precise, we're going to talk about two settlements, Kazachye Lagery, this one the settlement, and the second one is Krynki. Today we got a lot of very interesting updates from this territory, and the first update we got somewhere at 10 a.m. of the local time from the Russian sources. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings and storming operation or landing operation, the Ukrainians managed to cross Dnieper River and to enter the settlement. Furthermore, some sources were saying that Ukrainians managed to capture entire settlement, and also the Russians reported that how could that happen? First of all, the Russians reported that for some reason the Russian military authorities took a decision to redeploy a significant number of forces from Kazachye Lagery from this bank of Dnieper River, and the Russians sent them in direction of Zaporozhye. And the Russians left there just mobilized forces, slowly motivated forces, and so on. Furthermore, the Russian sources on the ground reported when the Russians sent reinforcement, and when reinforcement arrived, they found those mobilized soldiers drunk. So the situation is very complicated, yet we don't know what did really happen, but so let's continue that at 10 a.m. of the local time we got the first update that the Ukrainians landed on Kazachye Lagery and captured that settlement. After that, few hours later, the Russians published the first video of prisoners of war, and the author of this video claims that as a result of counter-offensive operation, the Russians managed to force the Ukrainians to step back. They managed to capture a lot of soldiers and so on. But few hours later, we got another update. We got some clarifications on the map, and according to sources, the Ukrainians managed to establish control and to capture this small part of the settlement on the, let's say, on the western part of Kazachye Lagery. So that part was under Russian-Ukraine control. After that, another few hours later, we got another update from the settlement by the name of Krynki. Another officer on the ground, soldier on the ground, or source on the ground reported that the Ukrainians managed to capture Kazachye Lagery or some part of that settlement. Furthermore, the Ukrainians have completed their regrouping in the vicinity of this settlement, Krynki. They managed to accumulate their armored vehicles and tanks on the Ukrainian bank of the river. Furthermore, the Ukrainians managed to create and establish pontoon bridges, and that a lot of Ukrainian infantry is already on the Russian side of the river and waiting in order to start offensive operation and storming of this settlement. So very difficult and very complicated situation. And now let's summarize the facts. We have that Ukrainians entered and landed. This is the first fact. The second fact is that the Ukrainians managed to capture some part of the settlement. The third fact, that the Russians were forced for some reason to move a lot of forces from this area in direction of Zaporozhye. Probably the Russians expecting some beginning of another wave of offensive operation. The next fact is that the Russians managed to send some reserves, which managed to force some Ukrainian forces to step back. They managed to capture some prisoners of war. And the final fact is that the Ukrainians are preparing themselves before another operation in direction of Krynki. Yet there were no updates about any attempt or any evidence that Ukrainians have already started this operation in direction of Krynki. Of course, if we will summarize one more time, it's very difficult to understand whether it's speculation or real updates or something else, but for sure we can tell and we can say and we can get from this situation one fact, is that no matter the situation with the settlements, as I understand for sure, the Ukrainians have control or established control over the islands between the Ukrainian bank of Dnieper River and the Russian bank. So these islands are under complete Ukrainian control. And even if the Russians were able to force the Ukrainians to step back, anyway, there are still a lot of infantry. I'm not sure about the piece of news regarding tanks and armored vehicles. For now, I don't see and I can't understand how the Ukrainians can use tanks among these part of the islands, because it's very difficult to use because of the quality of the ground. But anyway, we see the intensifying of clashes in this territory. Furthermore, the Russian sources published another episode of battles along Dnieper Dnipro River. This video is not geolocated, but according to the author of this video, this is another episode of another attempt of Ukrainian forces to cross the Dnipro River and to capture the bridgehead on the Russian side. But that was some kind of ambush. The Ukrainian soldiers were discovered by the Ukrainian intelligence, by the forces, and the Russians counterattacked very fast. And as a result of small fightings, the Ukrainians understood that that was an ambush, and they tried to evacuate from the Russian bank of the river. And probably as a result of that video, the Ukrainians managed to evacuate, and probably with the minimal losses or something like this. Furthermore, I'll remind you that all these days, the recent days and today, the Russians were bombing this bank of the river heavily. For example, today we got some report without video or photo confirmations that somewhere at 6 p.m. of the local time, the Russians start bombing and shelling with guided bombs the Ukrainian bank of the river in the vicinity of Berislav, the main area where the Ukrainians accumulated their forces, and probably those forces were involved in that landing operation. Furthermore, the Russians published another video of usage of the guided bombs in the vicinity of Kazatskaya, and according to this geolocated video, we see that this area is closer to the possible landing operation area. Furthermore, if we increase the number of updates that we got from this bridgehead, let's say from the 20th of July, we're going to see that there were a lot of bombings from the Russian side. For example, on this video in Kazatskaya, we're going to see another usage of guided bombs. This event took place on 25th of July, so not very, like 2 weeks ago. Another video from the same area, another usage of the guided bombs in this same area. So basically the Russians had information, had updates that there are a lot of Ukrainians on this bank of the river, and the Russians were trying to prevent this landing operation as much as possible. And they were bombing the Ukrainians as much as they can. Another usage of the guided bombs in the vicinity of Lvov also that took place a few days ago. But the Ukrainians have accumulated their forces, and the Russians probably knew about upcoming plans of the Ukrainian side to renewal their offensive operation in Zaporozhye, which forced them to send some forces from this area, and the Ukrainians used that situation and managed to cross the river. Furthermore, I'll remind you that during the previous 2 weeks, the Russians managed to shut down at least 2 IRIS-T air defense systems on the same, almost in the same part of Kherson region. This is the first evidence of destroyed IRIS-T air defense system by Lancet, and a few kilometers to the west, another IRIS-T system was destroyed by the Russian system Lancet. What does it mean? As you can see, the Ukrainians also have accumulated significant number of air defense systems on this side of Kherson area, and the main purpose of that was to protect and to establish defense for the troopers that will try to cross the river, because the Russians are using guided bombs for attacking Ukrainian positions with the guided bombs. They need aircrafts, and so this is like the pictures, the puzzles of this very big picture. So we see that probably the Ukrainians will make more attempts to continue this operation. Furthermore, the Minister of Defense reported that as a result of fierce fightings in this area, the Ukrainians lost at least 50 soldiers and 2 armored vehicles. When talking about the forces that were involved in this operation, from this perspective, we see some interesting updates. There is like 126th Territory Defense Brigade. There is 121st Defense Brigade. There is 124th Defense Brigade. There is 122nd Defense Brigade. So as you can see, the main forces that's located in this area which were involved in those operations is Territory Defense Brigade. And when talking about other brigades, there is one artillery brigade, 406, and another one is located a little bit to the north, 48th Artillery Brigade. When talking about mobile forces, there is just 46 air mobile forces, but the Russian source reported that this brigade was redeployed to Zaporozhye. So everything is very complicated, and when talking about the structure of the forces, I don't see offensive forces that can complete this landing operation. But when talking about the heaviest losses of Ukrainians in Zaporozhye area, I won't be surprised that Ukrainians, I'm not going to be surprised if Ukrainians will use every type of forces they have, but to complete and to show at least some media victory in the vicinity of this area. So let's wait more, but for now the updates are not very good for the Russian side. Now we're moving to Zaporozhye area. We haven't received nothing almost from this bridgehead. The Russians, after a few days, after few weeks of Ukrainian offensive operation in this area, when the Ukrainians were defeated, launched their own counter-offensive operation, and basically the Russians are trying to return the trenches and fortifications and the strongholds on the fields that were under Ukrainian control during the previous 2 weeks. The Ukrainians, some sources were saying that Ukrainians made few attempts to counterattack one more time, but those were another reconnaissance operation, or maybe attempts to give the Russians possibilities to return this territory under their control back. Now, when talking about the Zaporozhye area, the Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings in this area, the Ukrainians lost 110 soldiers and 9 armored vehicles. When talking about Vremivka tactical bridgehead, the Ukrainians, since the beginning of this day, since the beginning of the 8th of August, were trying to attack in direction of northern part of Urozhaine. But yet the Russians still control this settlement, and they are not giving the Ukrainians even a chances to capture this small village. If we increase the number of updates since the beginning of 23rd of July, we see that there are no icons of Russian bombing this settlement. If you take a look at Staromayorsk, we see the icons of 2 colors. This is the basic logic. For example, if Ukrainians get inside of the settlement and if the Russians withdraw their position, in an hour later, the Russians start bombing and shelling this settlement. And such situation we saw in Staromayorsk. When the Russians were forced to step back from this settlement to the south, the Russians start attacking this settlement with artillery systems. When talking about Urozhaine, as you can see, there are no Russian icons of Russian attacks this settlement, which means that the Russians still inside of the settlement and the Ukrainians haven't captured even the northern part of this area. But some sources are saying that the Ukrainians managed to advance and probably to capture a few buildings. But I believe that those were some kind of speculations. Furthermore, we got updates and other evidence that Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russian infantry on the northern part. On this video, we see how the Russian forces were trying to evacuate their wounded soldiers inside of the building. The Ukrainians discovered the Russian, probably small operational hospital, local hospital, and after that they started bombing that area. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings in the vicinity of Staromayorsk and Urozhaine, the Ukrainians lost around 125 soldiers, 8 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems. Now we're moving to the South Donetsk area. We haven't received nothing from this area as well, just the videos that we discussed in the previous time. Just like the bombings of Ugledar, we got the usage of another type of weapon from the Russian side, nothing more. Now we're going to Marinka and Donetsk area. Today we got a lot of interesting updates from this bridgehead. The Ukrainians started bombing and attacking and striking the Russian positions with drones massively in the vicinity of Marinka, and to be more precise, in the south of Krasnogorovka, where the Russians, as a result of the previous fightings in this area, managed to accumulate significant attack feast on the line between the coal mine and the railways. So basically the Russians completed their regrouping, accumulated 2 attack feast, and the Russians are ready to continue their offensive operation in direction of Krasnogorovka. The Ukrainians see everything, and this is the reason why they started hunting and bombing the Russians exactly behind their main feast positions. Furthermore, today the Russians published another very interesting video from the northern stronghold of Krasnogorovka, northeastern one. They continue bombing and shelling this settlement, trying to reduce the Ukrainian possibilities to defend this area, trying to reduce the number of Ukrainian forces in this settlement in this area as much as possible. And the thing is that this is not the first video from this area. This is the second update for the last 2 weeks. The previous one was about just bombing and shelling the settlement with artillery, with all type of weapon they have. After the Russians completed their artillery bombings of the settlement, they started the drone attacks, just local clearing, by trying to destroy and discover Ukrainian soldiers. And all these updates tells me that the Russians is about to finish their artillery and drone preparation on the northern edge, and also very soon, probably even this week, the Russians will make attempt to capture this stronghold. And this is very important, because if the Russians are able to capture the east-northern stronghold of Krasnogorovka, then they're going to be a real problem for the Ukrainians. It's not going to be like encirclement or something like this, but anyway, the Russians at this moment will receive at least 3 areas to attack in direction of the settlement. Furthermore, today we got another interesting update from the northern part, from Pervomayska. The Russians discovered Ukrainian positions, the positions of Ukrainian reserves, the accumulation of their forces, their barracks with armored vehicles, and after that they attacked and bombed these positions, trying to reduce the Ukrainian possibilities in this region as well. So what is the purpose of these bombings and this video? Probably it's like a regular job for the Russians and as well as for the Ukrainians to attack discovered positions of each other, but I see this situation a little bit wider. The thing is that there is another forced point that the Russians need to capture if they want to complete the story of Krasnogorovka, and I'm talking about Nivolska, this settlement. And there is just one way how to supply and support this area, and the main supply road goes from Pervomayska. During the previous weeks, we got a lot of updates from this area as well. If we will increase the number of updates, we got that the Russians were bombing and shelling this area heavily. They managed to destroy a few tanks. They bombed Ukrainian positions along the forest lines. So also we see that the Russians have completed their artillery preparation of this area, and very soon they also can try to attack this settlement. And if the Russians can capture Nivolska, if they can develop their bridgehead to the west, of course this is going to be the beginning of the end of Krasnogorovka story, obviously. But so one more time, if the Russians want to capture Krasnogorovka, they need to control 4 points: the coal mine, the railways, the northeastern stronghold, and Nivolska. If they can establish control over these 4 strategical points, the question of it's not going to be a question of fall of Krasnogorovka. It's going to be the question of time when the settlement is going to fall under the Russian pressure. At least for now, the Russians have completed at least 50% of the tasks they need, and currently they are focused on the northern stronghold. And furthermore, if the Russians can capture this stronghold, this like edge position in Krasnogorovka, it will open the Russian opportunity to start development of their offensive operation to the north, so basically behind of Nivolska. So I see this operation, and this is exactly what the Russians are trying to implement. And of course, if the Russians can capture Krasnogorovka, it will reduce the number of shelling and attacks in direction of Donetsk agglomeration, which will of course reduce the level of loss among civilians. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings on Donetsk front line, the Ukrainians lost 210 soldiers, 11 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system, and 1 tank, and 3 artillery systems. When talking about Bakhmut and Klishchievka, Artyomov's front line, the Ukrainians made an attempt to develop their bridgehead in the vicinity of Andreevka, Zinopolia, and Kurdyumovka. The Ukrainians started their offensive operation. They sent some convoys and armored fists in direction of between Andreevka and Kurdyumovka. The Russians discovered those movements, and after that they start bombing and shelling the Ukrainian forces. As a result of those artillery strikes, the Ukraine lost significant number of armored vehicles and infantry and were forced to step back. After that, the Russians started bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions in Deliivka, so basically operational reserves of Ukrainian forces that were involved in the offensive operation in direction of Andreevka. So basically the Ukrainian plans to penetrate the Russian defense belt were ruined, and the Ukrainians were forced to step back towards their beginning position. So this was this is the example of another usage of guided bombs behind the behind the combat line. So one more time, the Ukrainians were attacking this direction. They were discovered, and then they were attacked by artillery and were forced to step back. When talking about Klishchievka itself, the Russians launched a series of counter-offensive operations in direction of this settlement. And as a result of fierce fightings, the Ukrainians were forced to step back to the forest and to the forest line behind the settlement. And the Russians, after that, the Ukrainians start bombing and attacking the settlement, the western part of the area. On this video, we see how the Russian soldier was wounded by the artillery strike, and after that, there was an evacuation operation. So the Russians haven't restored control over the edge west-southern position, but anyway, this territory currently is in in the gray zone, or at least under Russian, or at least not under Ukrainian control. It's obviously. When talking about the northern area in the vicinity of Berkhovka water reservoir, if you remember, the Ukrainians during the days were trying to attack along the railways. Their movement was discovered by the Russians. The Russians even didn't need to use their tanks. They destroyed and attacked the Ukrainians with artillery systems, and as a result of that attack, the Ukrainians lost significant number of armored vehicles and were forced to step back. But probably during that attack, the Ukrainians managed to got probably the most important thing. They got the information regarding the Russian fire positions of drones, of air houses, of artillery systems, and after defeat in the vicinity of Berkhovka water reservoir, the Ukrainians start bombing and attacking and hunting the Russian discovered positions of their supply roads, of their tracks, of their artillery positions, of ammo depots, and many other things. Furthermore, the Ukrainians discovered the Russian artillery position D1 and also destroyed them as a result of artillery strikes. So this is the only benefits that Ukrainians managed to got after unsuccessful attempt to attack in the vicinity in direction of Berkhovka and Yagidne. Now we are moving to the northern area, to Liman front line. The situation is stable in this area. As a result of fierce fightings, the Ukrainians lost 80 soldiers and 6 armored vehicles. The Russians controls this small salient. The Ukrainians controls Zarechno and Tarskoye. The Ukrainians try to hunt and attack the Russian forces while supporting and supplying, because the Russian edge positions are located very far from Kremenaya, and this gives the Ukrainians opportunities to hunt and to attack the Russian armored vehicles during the rotation process, during the usage of the road between the edge positions and Kremenaya, and the Ukrainians are doing this pretty successful. But from the other side, the Russians have redeployed their Ka-52 helicopters in this area, and the Russians recently started publishing more and more videos about attacks against the Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian armored vehicles. And for example, in this video we see how the Russians managed to destroy on Liman front line at least 2 armored vehicles of Ukrainian forces. Now we are moving further, probably to another, the most interesting area, the Kupyansk front line. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings in this area, the Ukrainians lost 110 soldiers. The Russians managed to repel at least 9 counterattacks from the Ukrainian side. So I analyzed this area very long time. I spent a lot of time trying to understand the purpose of the Russian movements in direction of Petropavlovka, which we discussed yesterday, and probably today I have found the solution, at least the answers to my questions, and I will try to share with you my opinion about the situation in the Kupyansk front line. And the answer to my questions I got after this morning. We got updates that the Russians launched their offensive operation in direction of Ivanovka, the settlement that located on the north of Kislyovka and Kotlarovka. That was, or probably this is still the reconnaissance operation, reconnaissance in combat. We haven't received the numbers or details about this offensive operation or the results, but anyway, currently as understand, Ivanovka and Stepovo Novoselovka are the primary target for the Russians. So basically, as a result of those and the upcoming offensive operation in this area is going to be establishing control over these 2 settlements, Ivanovka and Stepovo Novoselovka. And the main purpose of this offensive operation that the Russians will try to implement within the next few days is to establish fire control and physical fire, every types of control over this interception of railways and road N26. Basically, the Russians want to cut the supply and support road that goes from Kupyansk in direction of another Ukrainian stronghold on this area, Kislovka-Kotlarovka agglomeration. So this is the first Russian step in this very big offensive operation. If we take a look on this map, we're going to see that this road N26 is the probably the best solution for the Ukrainians, how to supply and support this, let's say, edge stronghold of Ukrainian forces in Kislyovka and Kotlarovka. And if the Russians are able to cut this road, then the Ukrainians will be forced to go and to supply and support these forces from the south. They will be forced to go to the south, to Tabaevka, from Tabaevka to Pishane, from Pishane to Berestova, and from Berestova to Oskol River. As you can see, In this case, the Ukrainians' logistic will be increased significantly. They will be forced to use local roads, to destroy bridges and the area, and so they're going to have to make a very big hook, because from Moscow River they're going to have to go to the north to Kupyansk. So they will increase the logistic in twice. But this is not the only problem. Furthermore, don't forget that recently the Russians announced about establishing control over Novoselyovka. Currently, they're regrouping their forces, and after the finishing of regrouping, of course, the Russians will increase the pressure in direction of Berestova. This is the only explanation of Russian offensive operation in the vicinity of Novoselyovska. And if, one more time, of course, it's another if, but anyway, if the Russians can capture Berestova and develop their offensive operation in this direction, then it will allow them to establish another physical control over the southern supply road that goes to Klishchievka-Kotlerovka fortification and stronghold. And after these two successful offensive operations, if the Russians, of course, are able to implement them, the Ukrainian forces in Kislyovka and Kotlerovka will be operational encircled. Of course, this is going to be maybe not even a classical operational encirclement. This is going to be just the problems for the Ukrainians, because in this situation the Ukrainians will be forced to do one important thing. And the thing is that anyway, the Ukrainians will not step back or withdraw their positions. The Ukrainians will try to find a solution how to supply and support the Ukrainian forces in Kislovka and Kotlerovka. And the only possible solution in this situation is to start supporting these forces through the fields. So let's say in this direction. Of course, so what is bad in this decision? There is nothing bad. This is a very nice decision. But if the Ukrainians will start supporting their forces in Kislyovka-Kotlerovka stronghold using the fields, they will discover their safe roads and their minefields. And this is the most important piece of information that the Russians need to achieve before the next stage of offensive operation. The Ukrainians will be forced to demine the fields, they will be forced to use this area, and they will be forced to show the Russians the safe roads that, of course, the Russians will use in the next phase of offensive operation in a Oskol direction. And now the question, so what is the purpose of Russian offensive operation between Vilshany, Pershatnyavno and Petropavlovka? And the same situation, the same story. The Russians are trying to maintain the gap and to get as close as possible to road N26. If we calculate the distance between, let's say, Vilshany, the current Russian positions, and the road N26, the distance is 10 kilometers. But if, let's change the color, okay, let's use yellow color. But if the Russians are able to get as close as possible, I'm not sure that they will send their artillery systems very close, but who knows. If the Russians can get this defense belt, from this defense belt, the distance is around, let's say, from this defense belt to the road is around, my god, the wrong icon, sorry. The distance is around 6 kilometers. Of course, it will reduce the timings that the Russians need to coordinate their artillery systems. It will reduce the timings, and it will increase the accuracy of Russian artillery. So basically, the current deployments and current developments of the Russians between Vilshany and Peshatravno has just one purpose: to establish fire control over the living road between Petropavlovka and Kislovka-Kotlerovka. And by setting this control, by increasing the level of losses from the Ukrainian side, they will reduce the let's say, the defense possibilities of Ukrainians in Stepovo, Novoselovka and Ivanovka, which will allow the Russians to develop this operation successfully, which they're trying to currently implement. So this is my understanding of the Russian operation, of the Russian Kupyansk offensive operation. Probably, and just another video from Kharkiv area, how the Ukrainians discovered their own positions in Vovchansk, and the Russians, after reconnaissance operation, destroy another Ukrainian positions, another Ukrainian ammo depot, warehouse, and as a result of usage of guided bombs, the Ukrainians had another losses on this bridgehead. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.